All right, everyone. New York is considering more layers of unconstitutional anti-Second Amendment legislation, colloquially termed gun control, thanks to Cuomo and others there. You know, they're stacked with Democrats. It's a far blue state. It's sort of like, if Wyoming were to attack gay marriage or something. It's one of those wedge issues the left harangues about a lot. The problem is for the left, courts have been, over the last decade, generally more proactive at striking down some of the worst legislation. The new one is a real humdinger. This is what they're actually suggesting. They're suggesting that in order to get a permit for, I believe, concealed carry specifically in the state of New York, you're going to have to allow them to have your social media passwords, and then they'll check to make sure you're not using biased language like in your messages. So in your private interactions, they're going to dig through your trash, in other words, to find out whether you're loyal to their particular political ideology. The problem is this would almost certainly apply to blocking conservatives from buying guns at all, insofar as they exist in New York anyway. Outside of New York City, it's actually, technically speaking, New York is a red state. New York would be a red state if it weren't for New York City. A lot of people don't know this. They think, oh, New York, it's all liberals. No, if you go up, not that far west of here into New York, it's almost completely Republican, actually. It's very funny. You see people occasionally with Confederate flags, which is even more funny. There's one person in this neighborhood that used to fly a Confederate flag. I'm like, you do realize that you're in the deepest Union state you can possibly be in, right? Yeah, it doesn't make much sense to me, I suppose, but maybe they're from the South and they moved here, so I don't know. Here's the thing. This would get struck down very quickly by a federal court. The idea that the government has the right... The problem is you can't turn a right into a privilege. This would definitely do that. The idea that someone can use non-criminal language that doesn't indicate either lunacy, that is the mental inability, or criminality, intent or admission to a crime. The idea that any other form of speech can be used to deny a person their fundamental constitutional rights is ludicrous. It'll never stand up in a court. That violates the Constitution on so many possible levels. Not just the Second Amendment. It also violates the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, I think, and the idea of equal protection under the law. It would be thrown out in a day. It would be laughed out of court. If they pass this, it's suicidal to do so. The federal court will come in and issue an injunction. Because a plaintiff will say, well, they want my Facebook password. I'm not giving it to them and they're trying to deny me a permit. I'm suing. They will win very, very quickly, no matter how many attorneys the state happens to be fielding at the time. We've gone through this before. This is almost a little bit like the Cruikshank decision now, which I've spoken of. The history of gun control in the United States begins in 1874, I believe was the specific year, with a court decision involving Cruikshank. And the idea was that before that it was understood that the Second Amendment broadly applied to the whole population able to muster arms. That includes, by the way, people who weren't even old enough to vote, like, some 15-year-old. Yeah, they could go out and buy a revolver at the time. It wasn't considered a problem. It was women who at the time I don't even think could fully own property yet and hadn't gotten the vote. They could own weapons. It was understood that anybody who wanted a firearm could obtain a firearm. It was just normal capitalism. People hunted. People, fucking did whatever. They defended their property with guns. It was the most effective means to do so, especially up until that point, where you get some of the more then modern weapons. Very important for defending against being raided by, on the frontier especially, by groups that didn't fall broadly under the laws and national sort of system of the United States at all, namely Mesoamerican tribes of various groups. Or incursions by maybe Mexican forces or something in some of these frontier areas. There's always the chance of that happening. Or even somebody who they weren't really a citizen of the U.S., they just sort of lived off in the hinterlands like a hermit. Maybe they raid you, they try to steal your meat or something. There was a very real risk at the time. The Cruikshank decision, in that one, a bunch of Southern Democrats representing the Ku Klux Klan, among other groups. Yes, that is the history of the Democratic Party in this country. You can think, well, the party is reversed under Nixon. Okay, you make that claim, but at the time they were Democrats as a party, broadly. They argued that, no, the Second Amendment only applies to organized militias. Well, that's not the whole population. No. We have the right to deny a person the Second Amendment rights to them if we want. It doesn't apply to individual gun ownership. It applies to the more organized side of it. Oh, yeah, says the courts, that makes sense. The reason why they decided that way is because a court stacked with Southern Democrats, of course, at the time, decided, hey, all of these black people that just became citizens will own guns. Oh my goodness, they'll be coming, they'll shoot us, for having owned slaves. They'll break containment. They'll vote for Republicans or something. We can't let that happen. We got to keep them down. Essentially, was their mentality. We're gonna strip them of the right to bear arms. Gun owners won't issue them weapons. They'll be disarmed. Only white people will be able to own them. And it was lopsided. And it was Jim Crow's deliberately to prevent people who were not white from owning firearms. That's the long and short history of the beginning of gun control. The first meaningful gun control in the country was the Cruikshank decision. It was an attempt by the Ku Klux Klan to be able to raid black people and scare them at night without worrying about being shot at. Because then they could prosecute them. They say, well, it's not self-defense. You're not allowed to own a gun because you're black. That's the whole thing. They would make up a million other reasons why. It was sort of like the voting tests that they had during Jim Crow, where you literally couldn't answer the question correctly. And so it was basically up to the scorekeeper to determine whether they would pass you or not. And so if you were black, there was a 0% chance of passing. If you were white, yeah, unless you were known to be like too Republican or something, then they might deny it to you. Oh, haha, you're dumb. You didn't know the answer to this question that you can't actually answer. So it was a problem. So there's the thing. Now you've got the Democratic Party, once again, attempting to disarm people. These days it's not about race so much, although it does affect them. You'd think of, some of these cases, especially on the town level, which are the groups that are creating more gun control? They're urban groups, run by Democrats, and typically represent disproportionately minority communities. There's the long and short of it. Meanwhile, they totally ignore gang crime that's happening among people who are already criminals and won't listen to gun control, and they're not going to go and say, hey, they're going to show up in full Crip gear to the police station. Hey, I want a concealed carry permit, man. It's not going to happen. They're going to be carrying a piece anyway because they don't give a fuck. They're already engaged in criminal behavior. But they don't want to talk about that. That's a difficult issue for Democrats because the Democrats, I hate to say it, the Dems are the real racists in some ways. They're the ones representing these communities, fucking running them into the ground. It's very funny when people complain about, like, Flint's water. Oh, the evil Trump is making the water bad. Democrats controlled Flint for the last 20 years. It wasn't their fault, though, that the water was tainted with lead and making people mentally disabled and shit because of lead poisoning. No, that's a Republican's fault. States run by Democrats, towns run by Democrats. There was a Democratic president just now, but it's all your fault. You evil right-wingers hate black people and want to feed them poisoned water. It's crazy talk. Gun control's the same way. They'll say, my children, my children. And you do realize that not that many children are killed by guns every year in this country. Now, you should be building laws to mandate more vaccines or something. That's killing a lot of kids right now. Now, by the way, that's a gray issue that libertarians, admittedly, I have a big problem with. Because on one hand, I'm like, well, the government shouldn't be forcing you to take a kneel. But on the other hand, I'm like, well, yeah, but, herd immunity is breaking down and it's going to kill millions of people. Yeah, that sort of violates the NAP at least some degree, I think, too. It's a difficult issue, and really it is difficult for me. Some of these issues I can't give a straight answer on. I'm still pondering them myself. On guns, though, I can say, yes, the idea that the government can peek into your Facebook messages and say, oh, we want to look at your dick pics to make sure that you're not compensating. Otherwise, you can't carry a gun around. No, that's unconstitutional. I think Cuomo should definitely sign it. The Senate there should definitely pass it because it'll show that the Democrats hate the Constitution because it'll get shot down by the courts. And that'll set a national precedent too. That'll be wonderful because then it'll prevent that from ever happening on the national level. It'll provide a very solid precedent for that being unlawful. Great. I think it's a wonderful idea. Go ahead and waste millions of your New York taxpayers' dollars fighting a fight that you cannot win. Wonderful time. That's about all. Peace out.